I'd like to welcome you all to this conference on climate change. We titled it Beyond Competition. It's a question mark. I'll come back to that shortly. China, climate change, security, and the developing world. I'm Chung Yi Tan. I'm this year as the faculty director for the Year of China initiative. So I'm a physicist. Perhaps I should begin to say a few things about the Year of China and to put everything in proper perspective and before we come to the main topic of this particular symposium. Nearly 6 years ago, under the leadership of President Simmons and the then Provost Kurtzer, Brown began a serious effort on internationalization. Most of us by then recognized for Brown to be a leading national and international institution of higher learning, we must change our curriculum and research emphasis to make it much more increasingly global. The Year of China is a natural extension of Brown's strategic initiative of internationalization. The primary purpose of this initiative is to introduce our students to Chinese culture, examine China's current and future role on the world stage. It is a timely effort because of China's dynamic global presence that has already made an impact on our students and the world. In fact, many of us believe Brown's future as an institution depends on making the campus more a part of the world, a world in which Chinese presence is immense. The Year of China draws attention to the increasingly global nature of a Brown education. In fact, we would like to, through this year-long effort, to bring China to Brown, and then in turn, also to bring Brown to China. Throughout this year, we have explored the rich culture, economy, politics of Greater China, investigating its past, examining its present, and contemplating the future. Well, I have already mentioned I'm a physicist, so it probably was a little strange for me to play this particular role. In fact, I know very little about China, spending most of my career as a theoretical physicist, which doesn't somehow, the nature of a Chinese history, everything doesn't seem to have entered into it very much. So in fact, this is an interesting personal experience. When I was asked to take on this chore, I said, sure, I know about China. Then very soon I found out that I knew very little. So this is actually a very interesting personal experience. So when I took on this job, I said, sure, this is easy. We'll divide our program into 3 parts: the past, history, and where China stands now, and then divide the program into looking into the future. And of course, when you look at the past, you think about Chinese culture, history, civilization, arts, and everything, which I knew very little. And I engaged a lot of faculty and experts in this area. And very soon I learned it's very hard to divide things into thematic or topical subjects. At the same time, try to divide it into past, present, and future. For instance, we will try to look at history and civilization. And very soon I realized, and people try to convince me, when you talk about Chinese culture, history, it's very hard to separate technology and science and art and culture at the same time. To understand China, you have its history, you have to understand what drove China at a given time. In fact, we have a lot of events talking about arts and science of China of the past. We have learned that arts and science have flourished over China's long history. And this creation of a culture defines its present. And we have a lot of events, and to understand present and look ahead to the future, in fact, you have to understand its past. And so we come to the issue of climate change. Of course, this is for something which is very people's concern on now and the future. And we hope this particular event is just a start of a long-term discourse at Brown. And not only would we like to focus on this particular issue of climate change, of course, we need to understand the relation of China and US and the world. To understand US, we have to understand our culture, our value, and its past, and what really that is what we hold as what is most important to us in terms of our understanding of the world. Same thing, to understand Chinese view perspective, we also have to understand its history, its current politics, and economic, what drives their policy making. So in that sense, while we're looking at the present, we're also looking at the future. And it's in that context, when Tim and us, several of us, talk about this particular event, we say, how do we frame this particular discussion? And we came up with a title which involves this, what I already was pointing out. We said, beyond competitions with a question mark. The question really is, can we frame all this discussion, both in terms where we are now and what's happen in the future? Much of the discussion, in the current discussion, if you read the press, coming from politicians, is very much in terms of competition. And some will characterize it as perhaps some of the discussion can be characterized as China bashing, or if you read the news coming from China, you will talk about that as propaganda. All those probably have some truth to it. The question really is, can we frame our current discussion and leading forward to the future more in terms of beyond competitions? I hope this can be a beginning of a dialogue and try to address the whole issue of the role of China on the global stage in that context. So I wish you well, and I have to go to teach a class on baby physics, but nevertheless, I'll try as much as I can to come back to this exciting discussion that's going to begin today. So here.
Thank you indeed, Chun-Yi, and thank you all for coming. I want to thank Chun-Yi, first of all, for doing this crucial work of actually getting the funding for this event. The Watson Institute has been extremely helpful. We want to thank especially its director, Carolyn Dean, who helped us out with this. The Vice President for International Affairs, Matt Gutman, you'll be meeting later this morning. He's going to introduce Senator Sheldon Whitehouse and Dan Rees-Snyder from the State Department. My name is Timmons Roberts. Sorry, I didn't say that. I direct the Center for Environmental Studies here at Brown. I'm a researcher on climate change, especially the relationship between developing countries and the developed world, and how we're going to negotiate a solution that's both feasible, scientifically adequate, and just, and includes the interests of both sides. I just wanted to give a little background. Last year, we put on a conference of really about the same size and style, about Latin America and climate change, which is part of a book project and some of the work of my research lab called the Climate and Development Lab. And then this year, as part of the Year of China, we decided to do one on China. So for me, it's a great opportunity to learn more, and that's the spirit in which I'm thrilled to have you all here, is that we can bring in the world experts, really, and hear from them about what are the different most important elements of the issue, from vulnerability in agriculture to energy to positions in negotiations, national economic planning, and so on. We've got a lot to learn. I want to thank also, while I'm doing this, Marty Downs at the Environmental Change Initiative, Patty Caton in the Center for Environmental Studies, Caroline Karp is back here. She's going to introduce a session this afternoon and participate in our final discussion. She's a senior lecturer at the Center for Environmental Studies and a JD expert on environmental policy and law. And she's been extremely helpful along the way. Shauna Weisberg and Lindsay Richardson and Ben at the Watson Institute have come through as well with crucial parts of our website, and we're hoping that the website will live on. I don't know if you all got to visit it. It's a whole new design that it's called Angle, some new public-facing material from the Watson Institute. I think quite gorgeous, sort of interactive design for a conference site. And so that's really raises the question of our video, and we want to thank our videographers for coming through the day. Thank you. And the idea here is that if it suits our speakers after their talks, at some point in the next week or so, we would put up their talks. If anybody says anything they wish they didn't or would not like to have on the web, we want to give you all the option to just say no later on, so that you'll at least feel comfortable speaking freely today, and you have the option of absolutely vetoing or putting anything on the web later. But we'll put up what we can, okay? So just be aware that it's really a great opportunity. Many people couldn't make it today for all kinds of reasons, but the impact of the event will be much greater if we can put more material up. Really at the core of organizing this have been Lin Lang. Hey, Lin Lang, where are you? Who has just been fantastic. I mean, the whole thing happened because of her work. We took a group of students to the Durban climate negotiations in December in South Africa, the UN negotiations, and Lin Lang went around to almost every single event about China or sponsored in the China pavilion, and found the best people in there. Many of them are here today. So thank you. And then, of course, Jean Lowenstein at the Center for Environmental Study, who has just knocked herself out. Oh, wait, I'm going to wait till she walks in the room. So the last thank you is for Jean, who has just knocked herself out in this last about 3 or 4 months of endless detail work, and she's been just wonderfully focused on making this a success. So thank you so much, Jean. Okay, on March 22, 2012, just about a week and a half ago, Bloomberg News article reported on the National Energy Administration briefing in Beijing that the world's largest producer and a user of coal, that is, China, was going to limit its output and consumption in its 5-year plan through 2015 to only 3.9 billion metric tons a year. Sounds like a lot, but it's really an important commitment. David Fang, the director of the China Coal Transport and Distribution Association, told a reporter that, quote, demand and output growth will definitely slow because of environmental concerns. The goals look difficult, though, unless the government can substantially reduce economic growth and suppress enough energy-intensive industries. So here's what's at stake. How can China limit its access to its own homegrown cheap fossil fuel and also have hopes of maintaining its blistering 7% economic growth through this 12th of its 5-year plans? The agency described changes to the national energy structure. That's a big deal. To environmental protection measures and restrictions on particulates, the sort of pollution that often comes out of coal-burning power plants. These latter are these lung-damaging chemicals which local people, including wealthy and poor, and governments are starting to move on in an attempt to keep their cities livable in Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangdong. Our goal today is to discuss and hopefully end this day with a bit of better understanding on how China thinks about climate change. There are many sides to the question, and we've posed a short list. These are the obvious 2 sides of climate policy: on the side of mitigation, or reducing emissions of greenhouse gases, which is crucial in the long term for human survival. And the other side, of course, is adaptation, coping with the changes that we're locked into and already seeing. In the short term, we're going to be hearing about that shortly. There's energy production to allow China to meet its dreams of economic growth, and there's geopolitics vis-a-vis the United States, Japan, Europe, the rest of Asia, and then the rest of the developing world, Africa and Latin America, where China is sourcing much of its drive for industrialization for its raw materials. How will China manage both this economic growth and attention to climate change? We'll discuss some of the roots of China's domestic economic and environmental policy and how these influence its positions in the United Nations negotiations on the treaty. And China is just pivotal in those negotiations. And as we figure out what's going to succeed the Kyoto Protocol, which was due to expire this year. How is the need for national development constraining and informing the negotiating position of China? What's the role of vulnerability in agriculture and other sectors to climate disasters in shaping its national and international policy? How is China interacting with other developing nations as it seeks out raw materials to feed its growth? How are science and technology driving China's positions? So our goal has been to create an intimate workshop. It's hopefully going to grow and become a little less intimate during the day, and it'll shrink as people come and go from their classes and other responsibilities with some of these great experts. As I said, here at Brown, our ambitions are great, but our bench is thin, frankly, on China. We need more China experts, and we need to bring in smart people like you all to help us understand the region. As you'll hear after lunch, my own climate and development lab now includes about 15 master's, undergraduate, and doctoral students and 2 fellows, and we're starting to work with the least developed countries, and so you'll hear a little bit about that, and then also a paper on Latin America. But first, our first session here is to hear from 4 top experts on China, and we'll hear some more at the end of the day. And again, in the middle, we'll hear from the senator and from Dan Reifsnyder from the State Department. So in this panel, we're going to be hearing from Yinlong Xu of the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences, Deborah Seligson, who's in the World Resources Institute, Shueman Wang from the World Bank, and Mark Levine, a senior scientist from the Lawrence Berkeley National Labs. And I've already run through what the rest of the day looks like. There will be, at the end of the day, a reception. We'll hope you'll stay around for that. That's going to be across, down the hall, straight ahead. And we have lunch for all the participants that'll be here, so we can keep it going. We'll have about an hour break. So let me first start by introducing our first speaker, Yinlong Xu, who is a PhD from the Climate Change Lab at the Institute for Environment and Sustainable Development in Agriculture. He got his PhD in the Institute of Atmospheric Physics at the Chinese Academy of Sciences in 1995. He joined the Institute of Environment and Sustainable Development in Agriculture, which was formerly the Agro-Meteorological Institute, CAAS, in 1996. And he's focused on the construction of climate change scenarios over China and impacts assessments. He worked in the Center for Climate Systems Research, Tokyo University, as a postdoctoral fellow, and in the UK's Met Office, the Hadley Climate Centre, as a visiting scientist in 2002. He's authorized to use PRESIS in China. He can explain what that means. He's the chief scientist of China's 10th 5-year and 11th 5-year plan, National Key Technologies Research and Development Program projects on the issue of climate change impacts assessments. And he just finished, he told us yesterday, leading the development of the latest adaptation plan at the national level for China, which has just finished its editing and is now going to press. He's technical coordinator for physical impacts and risk assessment of the China-UK-Swiss joint project on adapting to climate change in China, coordinating lead author of Chapter 3, Impacts to Climate Change and Adaptation on the People's Republic of China, Initial National Communications on Climate Change. And you get the idea, there's more. He's won the Scientific and Technical Award on Scientific Protection in China in 2004. I had a bunch of publications I was going to read off, but I've been up here too long, so we're really lucky to have you here today. Thank you for coming in. Yeah. Would you like to stand at the podium?
Yeah, I like to stand here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's great.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. I'm very glad to be invited to join this great event. I'd like to have a presentation on the adaptation work in China. Firstly, I will have a very brief introduction on the climate change effects, impacts, and vulnerability in China. And then I will have a brief introduction on China's National Adaptation Strategy Report. Actually, right now in China, there are two adaptation strategy reports. The first one is published by the Ministry of Science and Technology, the most published. It's more scientific. And based on the scientific adaptation report, strategy report, NDRC right now is organizing for the official adaptation strategy report, just as Timmons, Professor Roberts said that it will publish soon in the near future, not so long. And after that, because I'm from the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences, I will have a specific introduction for the agricultural adaptation in China. And after that, finally, I will have some proposals, some introductions on the key priority issues for adaptation, domestically and internationally. Firstly, about the climate change effects, impacts, and vulnerability in China. I think you all are familiar with this figure. Even we take the effective measures to control the emission of greenhouse gases, the warming would continue in this century. That's the climate change effects in China. The up to figures are the time series change, and the lower two figures are temperature and precipitation, the spatial changes. We could see that the warming is obvious in China. The warming trend is obvious. And it's the agro-meteorological disasters loss in China. In China, the drought is number one disaster for Chinese agriculture. Every year, the drought would cause a huge loss for the crop production. Recently, there are a lot of disasters. For example, the frozen snow disaster in the year 2008 and 9, and it's a drought disaster in North China Plain right now, because North China Plain is a main crop production area. Right now, the drought is getting much more serious, and the cold damage. Actually for the climatic cold damage is decreased, but actually for the crop cold damage, right now it's enhanced. That's a problem for the coincidence, the matching between the crop and the weather, and the disaster of pests and disease. And it's a disaster, snow disaster and drought disaster for grassland, and the shortage of water resources. And we can see for the the two pictures, we can see the drought along the Yangtze River. The lake become, because of the drought, the lake became the grassland. It's terrible. It's a terrible damage to the ecosystem along the Yangtze River. Because now the climatic damage, the disaster is getting more and more serious than before, then we have to develop the adaptation strategy to cope with the climate change. Okay, that's the progress to cope with climate change in China. Firstly, just as Professor Robert mentioned, I'm involved for the China's initial national communication on climate change. The chapter 3 is climate change impacts and adaptation. That I could say that's the first official document to summarize the adaptation in China. But I could say that the adaptation measures summarized in the INC, the measures mainly are autonomous and passive, not the positive. From then in year 2007, we published the National Assessment Report on Climate Change. It's like the IPCC report, 3 components. The first component is for climate science, the second for impact and adaptation. The third part is for mitigation. I'm the coordinating lead author for the second component. We, relative to the INC, that the adaptation measures summarized and proposed in this report is more advanced. And in the mid of year 2007, the NDRC published the National Climate Program on Climate Change. In this report, in China, firstly proposed that the same importance, the parallel mitigation and adaptation is parallel, the same importance in China. Before that, actually, our work to address climate change mainly for mitigation. But right now, because our understanding on adaptation improved, and we have the specific report on national strategy, adaptation strategy. After the year 2007, because there are more understanding on how to address the climate change, then in China we believe that the adaptation is much more important than mitigation. However, later I will have a brief introduction for the relations between the mitigation and adaptation, the synergy effects between them. And if I'm allowed to have several minutes, I'd like to have an introduction for the adaptation strategy report, the most published report. Totally, there are 5 chapters. Chapter 1, introduction. Chapter 2, guideline, demands, and aims, the principles for the adaptation strategy in China. After that, it's the sectoral adaptation, about the sectoral adaptation tasks, the sectoral action plans. And for chapter 4, it's regional. Actually, we divide the China with different ways to cut like to cut the cake with different ways. Firstly, with the in the sectoral way. The secondly, with the regional way. For the regional challenges and action plans, we focus on the integrated problems. And finally, in chapter 5, the last chapter, we summarize the national synthesis tasks and action plan. For the introduction, firstly, to introduce the climate change facts and the future socio-economic development and the climate scenarios, and the to summarize the climate change impacts on all sectors and regional and regions, and to have a summarizing for the adaptation work we have done, and what's the shortcomings, what are barriers for the future adaptation. Based on it, then we summarize, in chapter 2, we summarize what's the demands for China's adaptation, and the guidelines and principles and aims. For the aims, we have short-term aims until 2020. We will adapt to the 1 Celsius degree warming. And for the long term, until 2050, we will adapt to the 2 to 3 Celsius degree warming. That's the China's adaptation aims. And based on it, then we have the sectoral adaptation plans for the key vulnerable sectors. Firstly, in China, it's agriculture, then water resources, forestry, coastal zone, human health, ecosystem, and biodiversity. We try to isolate the ecosystems and the biodiversity, but we feel that the measures is together, so we put them together for ecosystem and biodiversity. And the big projects, maybe, I don't know, it's easy to understand or not. For example, the big dam in 3 gorges of Yangtze River, something like that. It's very important in China and energy sector and other sectors. For other sectors, it doesn't mean they are not important. Just because we don't have enough scientific research on it. For example, the urban development, the second and tertiary industries, the environmental protection, the infrastructure and the social lives, they all are very important, but we don't have enough scientific research on it. So just have a very brief description on these sectors. And for the sectoral and regional adaptation, firstly, we summarize what's the challenges of climate change for the regions. For the next chapter, the same structure. The regional and sectoral challenges to climate change. Then, what's the main tasks for adaptation? Then, what's the exact action plan to do it? For the action plan, right now, targeted to the year 2020. For example, for agriculture, we summarize the challenges as the food security. To threaten the climate change would threaten the food security, to enhance the agro-meteorological disasters, and it's getting hard and hard to control the agricultural disease, pests and weeds, and degrading the grassland, and exacerbating the poverty. Something like that. Based on the challenges, then we propose the main tasks for adaptation. how to enhance the construction of agricultural infrastructures to accelerating agricultural industrialization and modernization, to develop the water saving techniques, to adjust the cropping systems, to develop adaptation techniques, to establish the early warning system, to complete, especially we propose to complete the adaptation technology checklists for the adaptation. And exactly the action plan. Exactly how to do. Totally there are, we proposed 10 aspects for the 10 action plans for Chinese agriculture. For example, the forage resourcing and planning, because in China, with the life improvement, then we need more meat. But right now, the grassland cannot, we cannot produce so much grass in the grassland. So for the pasture, we need the forage resource in the agricultural areas. How to do for it, the planning and the resourcing, something like that. We especially proposed to develop the pasture, to plant the grass, to try to find the high production grass, then to plant something like that to adapt to climate change. And for Chapter 4, for the regional challenges and action plans, we divided into China with 9 regions. In China, we have the traditional 7 regions divided. Besides that, we separated the Tibetan Plateau and also China's sea. Totally, there are 9 regions. And for the synthesis tasks and action plans, we have the proposal for the tasks, synthesis tasks for legislation, for the monitoring, for the scientific research, for disaster reduction, poverty alleviation, to raise the public awareness and for international cooperation. And for capacity building, especially we emphasized the coordination to establish the platform to have the funding. Funding is very important, and to for the intelligence and the international cooperation. I introduced the main content, the content of the most adaptation strategy report. The shortcoming is for this. Okay, all right. The shortcoming for this report is that the strategy measures we proposed is based on the impact assessment. Actually, based the impact assessment, we should have enough vulnerability and risk analysis. Right now, for that report, we lack for it. So we will improve the report, the adaptation report, strategy report in the 12th five-year plan. I'm also mandated from the most to complete the work. And the key priority issues, because for adaptation, I said I will have a brief. I will have a comment on the relation between the adaptation and mitigation. Actually, in China, in the adaptation strategy report, we strongly recommended that for the priority issues to incorporate the adaptation with the disaster reduction. Why? I will have a brief introduction for it later. And to incorporate the adaptation with poverty alleviation, to take the priority adaptation actions for those adaptation actions measures with the mitigation effects, synergy mitigation effects would be in the high priority for the adaptation, and also for the international cooperation, especially for the South-South cooperation. Why we incorporate the adaptation with disaster reduction? Actually, under the climate change background, there are some new features of the disasters. For example, I just summarized the agro-meteorological disasters. For example, in northern China, before, just for the spring drought, but right now, after the spring drought is also the summer drought, and also to put the hot temperature event together. So it's much more complex than before. And opposite to the hot temperature events is the cold damage on winter wheat. That's a new features in northern China. In southern China, the typhoon intensified, and the seasonal drought is intensified. And there's a sudden shift from the drought status to the flooding status, something like that. That's the new features for the agro-meteorological disasters. So, okay, I just summarized for the agricultural meteorological disasters. Because of these new features, we should incorporate our adaptation with the disaster reduction together. That's why we strongly proposed. And why we proposed to integrate the adaptation with the poverty elevation together. Here is China's map. We can see the yellow area. That's the semi-arid area. We call this area as the ecological barrier. This barrier to ensure the socio-economic development in the east part of China is very important. But along this yellow area, it's the main area for the poverty population, and I mean that because the poverty people lived in this area, so if we'll finish soon. How to see? If we don't take the adaptation priority actions, we can't imagine that the hungry poverty people could prevent the environment, the ecosystem when they are hungry. So that's the priority adaptation measures we should take along the poverty area. So that's why to integrate the poverty elevation with the adaptation action together. That's the priority areas for the ecosystem adaptation we proposed. It's along in the west edge of the yellow area. That's the action, the adaptation measures we used in the poverty area. For example, we plant the seed buxom to improve the vegetation, then to adapt to the drier climate. But for the seed buxom, there's also the economic benefit. So to integrate the poverty elevation and the adaptation together. About the South-South cooperation, right now, just as Professor Robert introduced, I'm the technical coordinator for the HPC project. It's a China, UK, Swiss joint project on the ACCC, the whole name is Adapting to Climate Change in China. There are totally 5 components for this project, from the climate science to comprehensive physical and social risk assessment, and for adaptive planning and capacity building and knowledge sharing. Based on it, before I came here, the DFID staff members and also experts from UK, we together talked about how to develop the South-South cooperation, especially in Africa. And NDRC also mandated me to have China-Africa cooperation, and also how to integrate the UK DFID cooperation and NDRC South-South cooperation together. Just one sentence about the adaptation and the mitigation, the relations. I repeated my ideas several times, but this time I'd like to repeat again. No successful adaptations in the developing countries, in China, in the developing countries, no successful mitigation all over the world. Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Yinlong. That was great. I think we need to go ahead with the other presenters because we have a time constraint. That is, Senator Whitehouse will be here about 11. His talk is supposed to be from 11:15 to about 11:45. So we'll try to keep going and save some time at the end. So next we have Deborah Seligson, who received her bachelor's degree from Harvard in East Asian Studies and did her master's degree from Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School in the really exciting Science, Technology, and Environmental Policy program led by Michael Oppenheimer on the climate change side. She was at the U.S. State Department for over 20 years, where she worked on energy and environmental issues in China, in India, Nepal, and New Zealand. Her most recent position was as Environment, Science, Technology, and Health Counselor on Beijing. Now she serves as Principal Investigator at World Resources Institute's Climate and Energy Program on issues in China, as well as writing for the China FAC on their China Climate and Energy Network. And she's getting a lot of press and attention. She blogs regularly at their site. If you can find her in the Associated Press, New York Times, America Public Media, MSNBC, and so on, Living on the Earth, Huffington Post, and on and on. She's writing on a bunch of issues connected with China and international climate policy. And so you can look her up, and we're looking forward to hearing from you. Thanks for coming all the way from China. We're glad you came and that you're getting to see your family. So that's a nice combination. Thanks. Lynn, can you help me get which one is yours here?
It says Seligson on it, so it should be easy. Okay, beautiful. So I never know where those things are, so I do it that way. Okay, so good morning. I think Professor Hsu's final comment was really important, actually, that, you know, for developing countries, if they don't feel that their needs in terms of adaptation are met, that demands on developing countries to mitigate will simply fall on deaf ears because they have to focus on their own welfare first. And I think that really is an excellent point. To start, what I'm going to talk about, and I do come more from having looked at the mitigation issue for a number of years, is how domestic policy, including economic policy and energy policy, fit into an overall climate policy in China, and how the international environment both constrains domestic policy and can encourage it, but I think often, especially in the United States, there's an overly high expectation that the international environment is an encourager. And in reality, the real impetus is domestic policy, and it's been much, much more important, especially to date. So if I look at what are the drivers of domestic climate policy, I think the first one that we have to look at is energy security. Energy security is overwhelmingly important in China, and I think people often forget that because the 1990s was a period when it was relatively less important than it has been historically or it is today. I first started covering Chinese energy issues in the early 1990s, and it was a moment when oil in China was going to go from being a net oil exporter to being a net oil importer, and there was an enormous amount of anxiety about this. If you go back earlier in Chinese history, but not that far, to the Sino-Soviet split, when the Soviets left, the oil left with them. And there was a lot of worry about China's survival. Remember, China has a lot of coal, but transport is pretty heavily dependent on oil. So when you suddenly don't have oil, life's not good. And at the same time, almost immediately thereafter, China found one of the world's largest oil fields at Daqing. And it was a national miracle that became sort of a center of cultural revolution propaganda, but it was the real thing in terms of oil. And for many, many years thereafter, they found a number of important but smaller oil fields, and domestic production was really very important, and they were an end exporter. That changed in the early 90s, seemed like it was going to be a big worry, but in fact the 1990s were a period of low and stable oil prices, and the change went almost unnoticed. And energy planning as a component of Chinese national policy really became a much smaller group within the government, not as high a priority. And in looking at the international climate negotiations, the main strategy was, well, we know we're going to have to mitigate, but let's make sure it doesn't affect economic growth. Not a lot of focus on these issues. It changed a lot after 2000 for a number of reasons. On the energy security side, a big one was actually the growth in oil imports. In particular, if you look at this graph, there's this year here where oil imports suddenly increased 16% in 1 year. As you'll notice, that turned out to be a bit of a fluke year. Chinese oil imports haven't grown that fast every year, but there was a lot of pressure internationally. That was a period like this year where U.S. gasoline prices were going up very fast, and people were like, see, it's all about China and Chinese imports, even though at that point China was 9% of world consumption, unlike the United States. But there was a lot of pressure. There was also a couple of votes in Congress that year back in 2005 where there was opposition to an attempt by the Chinese company CNOOC to buy U.S. oil company Unocal. Again, even though most of Unocal's assets weren't in the United States, there was also a sense of Congress vote against some Exim lending for China's purchase of Westinghouse nuclear power plants. And so all kinds of different approaches to energy internationally, whether it be new equipment, whether it be new sources of oil, China was looking at feeling more threatened around the world. And in doing that, it seemed like a fairly logical thing to do was to revive a bunch of really good policies that existed back in the 80s and 90s to improve energy efficiency, try to reduce energy intensity, try to reduce the pressure around the world, both economically and politically, in terms of energy resources. And so China really doubled down at home starting in 2006, looking both at improving its energy efficiency policies and diversifying supply, in particular into renewables. And we've seen this explosion in the wind industry, and then first in terms of solar power exports, but more recently in terms of using it at home. And of course, a big emphasis on nuclear as well. And despite that sense of Congress resolution, in fact, the US gave Exim lending, and China is buying Westinghouse nuclear power plants. So I'm going to steal Mark Levine's graph, and you'll probably see it again, but it's always worth looking at more than once. So that, energy intensity improved regularly, and you can go back way earlier than this. I mean, China had been improving energy intensity per unit GDP for a long time up until 2000. Then it turned around for a few years, and that created a lot more of this perception of ever increasing energy demand internationally, but they really have turned it around since 2005, and energy intensity per unit GDP is going down again. Another big driver in terms of where China is today on climate and especially on environmental policy is a very different notion of what it means to be a developed country, to be where it is in its stage of development. And I think this has really happened since 2000. And I think that it's worth looking at what this year-on-year increase, not of 7%, but of 10% average annual for 30 years has really meant in terms of cumulative GDP growth, especially since 2000. What you'll see is, because what it means when you grow at 10% a year is that your economy doubles every 7 years, that the amount of absolute growth since 2000 has been dramatic. And it's really changed the conception of how wealthy China is and what it can afford to do in terms of supplying public goods and services to its people. And I think it really has changed. And I put the US there too to remind us both that that doesn't mean that China's really rich. It's not. And it also doesn't mean that the US hasn't grown either. What's also striking is how much richer we were than when I was born, or even when the students here were born. So I think both of those are important to keep in mind. But what has been clear, especially since Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao came into office in 2003, is that there's a much broader notion of what it means to be a developed country, that it's not just about economics, that it's about providing a good quality of life to the Chinese people. And that means better health care, it means better pensions, it means cleaner air and cleaner water. And so those kind of drivers have been a big force. And one of the reasons I think that this has came so rapidly to the fore in the Hu and Wen administration is they came to power in the middle of the SARS crisis. And the SARS crisis really showed how something else that wasn't purely economic could have a dramatic impact on economic growth. So it became clear that social issues could have immediate and dramatic impacts. The SARS was also this incredible victory. Within a few months, it went from absolutely shutting Beijing down, and I lived in Beijing in those days, it was amazing, to being taken care of. And, biology is a weird thing, and there aren't that many diseases that have disappeared off the planet in the space of a year, but it is one that did, and it showed that, public policy could really make a rapid impact, and I think really emboldened people to feel they could do things in a wide variety of areas. As did WTO accession, which I think is the other big change post-2000, that the amount of policy change that happened in the late 1990s also meant that policymakers in Beijing felt they really could adopt new policies and really change the way things were done in a fairly rapid fashion. The environment has obviously been one of the areas I think that has really benefited from this, and this series of environmental crises has really driven a change. I mean, China went from having an advisory body on the environment in the 1990s to 1998 when it became an enforcement body called the State Environmental Protection Administration, to coming to ministry status in 2007, which in the Chinese system is really, really important. It's dramatically more powerful today than it was, and the ministry has used its power quite smartly. They adopted a couple of goals in the 11th five-year plan, 2006 through 2010, and they exceeded both those goals. And actually getting that to happen, I mean, they said they wanted 10% reduction each in sulfur dioxide and in chemical oxygen demand, which is water pollution measure. And they actually did better in both. In sulfur, it's down over 14% during that period. And remember, that's a period of almost doubling of the Chinese economy, including the number of power plants, which means that they installed scrubbers on virtually every power plant in China, and they installed continuous emissions monitoring equipment and got those scrubbers on and working most of the time, which is pretty impressive. So there were a bunch of crises, which I've kind of listed up here, that I think drove it, in particular the Songhua River spill back in 2005, which I always liken to their Exxon Valdez. It really was this national event where everybody was following it. CCTV covered it every day on the news for 60 days. So there was a lot of muckraking journalism. And one of the things is in China, environmental issues are one where journalists often feel free to go around and cover them and try to uncover, and they're often very, very critical of local government. So it isn't always the case, and it's also the case that after 60 days, CCTV stopped covering that spill. But it really has been part of what's enabled the Ministry of Environmental Protection to really assert its power within a government where it frankly doesn't have as much money as, for example, the National Development and Reform Commission. And I wouldn't claim it's the most powerful ministry, but if you compare where it is now to where it was 5 years ago, it's an incredible change. Climate impacts are obviously really important. I won't spend much time on that since we've just had an excellent presentation, except to say that the awareness of the link between climate change and the kinds of problems China sees is so much higher today than it was a decade ago. And that has a lot to do with where the climate science is and where Chinese climate scientists are in that discussion. If you go back to the third assessment of the IPCC on climate change, you actually will find very, very little in there on the impacts at mid-latitudes. And it's not till the fourth assessment, which comes out in, I think, 2007, right, that you see a lot of information on the impacts at mid-latitudes. And obviously, the way the IPCC works, that means that science, much of it's as much as a decade old, right, because it gets brought into a compendium and there are these big committees and whatever. And if you look at co-authors in the fourth assessment, the Chinese co-authors are about 10% of the total co-authors in that work, which is up again dramatically from where it was in the third assessment. And Qin Dahe, the then head of the Chinese Meteorological Administration, was the co-chair of the science working group. So you had a lot of awareness of what was going on in the science, a lot of participation in that science. So you had local scientists talking about impacts and new research on what was happening locally. And starting around 2006, 2007, I started hearing all the time at meetings extreme climate events and climate change linked to extreme weather events within China. And so I think that's been a big, big impact, linking the kinds of impacts that people were seeing to the climate science. Now, the link from where that is to mitigation, if you're a country with a less than $5,000 per capita GDP and you see that climate change is affecting you, your first response is going to be, what happened to those rich countries and why aren't they doing something about this? So it isn't necessarily the case that your immediate response is, gee, what do we have to do on the mitigation side? Your first and most intelligent response is, what are we going to have to do on the adaptation side, which I think is what Professor Xu was talking about and why adaptation in 2007 became such a fundamental policy. But I think it has invigorated the international negotiations to say we really have to push and we do have to get other countries to be doing more. So I think the impacts have affected Chinese climate policy, but because no single country, including China, can really affect the total amount of CO2 out there in the atmosphere, part of the way it's affected it is to reprioritize adaptation and to want to see more action from other countries. So when we look at the international context, I mean, going back to what I said before about all these drivers and the fact that China has this big energy efficiency program, as well as a clear renewable energy goal of 15% of non-fossil fuel by 2020 of their total primary energy mix. The domestic push for effective climate mitigation is quite strong. What the international context does is really complicate the matter, because when you look around at an agreement that you don't know what it's going to look like, what's going to get credited, where your baseline's going to be, all these crazy issues that are involved in international negotiations, it becomes this strategic chess game, and you're not sure whether holding back or putting forward is going to be better for your overall strategy, and I think has actually made it more strategic and complicated. And what has really driven policy forward has been a view that I think is often quite clearly articulated by Minister Xie Jianhua, that we have these domestic priorities in terms of energy security, in terms of environmental protection, that make these smart policies, and we need to do them. But international pressure in that sense has not been, I don't think, a particular driver. And there are times when, especially in terms of revealing the hand in terms of what China could do, that I think the international negotiations often act as a brake. And I think this has been particularly true since the failure of Waxman-Markey, when it became rather clear that the United States had very little to offer. And, you know, so because Europe's done pretty much what it's going to do, the US is not really doing a lot, although it could do some more things, and I'm glad to see the new EPA rules appear. But, you know, in terms of what China is going to do, their domestic imperatives have been higher. They are interested in the climate negotiations. They're very active, and much more active than they were before. But I think they see it as still something where it's not clear what they're going to get out of it. If we think about markets, though, I think international markets, and I won't talk too much about this because I think our next talk will be somewhat about this. Clearly, CDM has driven the Chinese renewables market. It's been really important in getting that going, and I think that's been very healthy. The other thing is that to the extent that other countries are mitigating actively, Chinese are very interested in being technology leaders in all these new emerging energy technologies. And so it's not just the negotiations themselves. It's clearly been the size of the European market that has also driven the development of solar technology in particular, but also wind technology, and gotten the Chinese interested in these. If the United States were to be a much more serious mitigator, I think that would again be an impetus for China to work even harder in terms of these technologies. And that doesn't necessarily mean anything negative for US jobs, because many of these technologies involve very large components that are produced wherever the demand is. So we've already seen a number of the major Chinese renewable energy companies open up shop in the US. And if we had more demand, I think we'd see more of that. But it's clear that the international context as a driver will be, I think, well, it's clear to me at least, that the main way it'll be a driver is if you see robust international demand for new technology. And so I think, just as I think China has a pretty smart climate policy in terms of efficiency and in terms of fuel substitution, if other countries simply choose to do what's smart for themselves, and that would include the United States, and also looking a lot at better efficiency and better fuel substitution, that is what's actually likely to be the biggest impetus for even greater mitigation in China. And so that's all I have to say, and I think I made the time limit.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Deborah. That was great. Okay. Next, we have Shuiman Wang, who's gonna. How am I doing with that? She earned her Master's of Law degree at Wuhan University in China, and then went to Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts. She worked at the Treaty and Law Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China. She basically has it all. She's worked for the Chinese delegation as one of the key negotiators on the Climate Change Convention and other environmental agreements. She worked at the UN Climate Change Secretariat in Bonn. So she's worked at the UN. She was responsible for climate negotiations and compliance regime. Then she was with the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity in Montreal, Canada, on the Biosafety Protocol on Trade and the Environment. And now she's a team leader for the Partnership for Market Readiness at the World Bank. So that's like a grand slam, right? Where she's working on this program of piloting innovative market instruments to scale up climate mitigation efforts. And then she was one of the lead authors on this, I think, quite influential 2010 World Development Report on climate change and development from the World Bank. Her publications have covered climate change as well as intersection of trade and environment. So rather than going on, I'm going to bring it up so we can get going here. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you.
Now let's see, where
I don't
are
have
you?
slides.
Oh, you don't have slides, right?
I'm sorry.
Great.
Well, thank you, Robert. Thank you for this nice introduction. And also invite me for sharing some my personal thoughts. I apologize, I don't have slides, but I
Hold
hope.
on 1 second, we hit the wrong button somewhere. Where's that? Let's get it, because we want to make sure we didn't lose our sound. Oh, that.
Okay, great. Apologize, I don't have slides. I guess I just want to use this opportunity to share some personal stories and observations. And of course, I would also like to talk now my favorite topic, the Chinese carbon market. And this is also one of the initiatives I'm currently working at the World Bank. But before that, I think that I was once upon a time, Dan knows very well, I was a negotiator. I guess I can't resist the temptation to share some observations. This transformational change in China in terms of negotiation of climate change under the UNFCCC process. And I remember that was early 1990s, 1994. That was my first international meeting to the UNFCCC in New York. And at that time, one of the famous Chinese negotiators, Dan's counterpart, declared that China under the UNFCCC would be developing country forever. So I remember, if you remember, that was a famous saying in New York. And I also remember at that time, as part of delegation, we would not even use the word mitigation. And mitigation almost like a taboo because that was something for developed countries, not for China. So that was the time we went to 1994 COP1 negotiating the Berlin Mandate successfully, putting this important term that no new commitment to developing countries under the Kyoto Protocol, and it was successful. It was a very difficult negotiation process, but that was the China at that time, very hard line and absolutely no new commitment, no mitigation, nothing. It's just whatever the climate change mitigation. That was only for the Annex 1 countries using the UNFCCC term, that's developed country parties. But then let's look at today. Today, this whole idea, green growth, low carbon, is everywhere. I would really think that really wholeheartedly embrace this low carbon concept. And also, again, some personal observations. Just 1 year ago, I was in China. I just look at some magazine, and I saw an advertisement say that, well, if anybody want to have a low carbon wedding, and contact this company. So low carbon, this concept, just to say this national awareness is really very high. And I talked to my sister, who works one of the biggest computer companies in China, and she told me this story that on the monthly basis, they have the kind of reflection. All the staff will have this kind of reports or reflection on their carbon footprint. So it's, it's a quite sharp contrast to, the practice of many other countries, including developed countries. So I just always wonder, what happened, the last 10 years, why this quite really dramatic transformational change, the awareness, the concept, really the value, is just really quite a big change. I would say that there are many, I think Debbie touched upon, and I just want to highlight four I would say probably the main aspects. Then first, as David said very clearly, that there has been really a painful realization that if China follows current growth model, it will not survive. And very recently, the Energy Research Institute published a report saying that the objective for China is to increase per capita income from today's $5,000 to 20,000 by 2030. If China follows exactly the same model, the growth model, even China uses the entire world's energy resources, China cannot get there. As simple as that. So what they have seen is that mitigation agenda offers opportunity. Climate negotiation also offers opportunity to force that also structure change. So I mean, there's a fundamental value. I mean, that previously, in the 1990s, climate change agenda was perceived as well, that's the developed countries' agenda, pushing China as a kind of a trap, trapping China so that contain China's development. I think to today, of course, there also has been still, I would say, probably suspicion there, but at the same time, really see it as opportunity and how use this outside pressure and also internal, of course, demand, and to force that structure change. So I would say that's a very important part. And secondly, I really think that there's a tipping point. David, you talk about your negotiations. In my view, that in fact, I would think it's quite important. I saw this change that between 2007, I think that was Bali Action Plan adopted, until 2009 Copenhagen conference. It's 2 years leading up, from 2007 to Copenhagen. I mean, that's many world leaders went to China and talking about climate change. So climate change, during that 2 years, from agenda probably just at the ministerial level, and now just really all the way to the top. And so that's a very important. We all know that whatever the issue, you need to have political leadership. I think those 2 years, that this is heavy engagement from the all over the world and leaders, really political leadership. That's a very important aspect. Chinese leaders also realize that climate change is not only some negotiations there, that it has some fundamental impact about China's own responsibility, about China's image, and about China's leadership. So that's the second part. And the third part, I would also say this whole climate diplomacy. And I like to use Copenhagen as an example. China went to Copenhagen as a shining example. Everybody looked to China's leadership, because China beforehand announced its mitigation intensity target. So went to Copenhagen, people expected China to play leadership, but China went out of Copenhagen. If you ever follow the negotiations, China was a scapegoat, blamed by everybody. It looked like a failure of Copenhagen. It's all Chinese fault. I would say, I was Copenhagen. And I would say that, this was, I would say, spectacular failure from Chinese part, on this mishandling the whole negotiation process. But on the other hand, I think China probably, the failure of Copenhagen has so many other reasons, but China certainly mishandled that process. But on the other hand, it's also painful realization that this climate diplomacy is absolutely critical, and China's relationship with other developing countries, with small island countries, with least developed countries, if China does not deal with climate change properly, eventually that China would get blamed, and it's very important for China's South-South and solidarity with developing countries. If China does not handle properly, one day we'll say Copenhagen again, and we'll say that the rest of developing countries would have that resentment. So that's, I would say, the third part. And the fourth part, I would also think that there's a growing sense of responsibility. And then I'm sure you remember a famous saying that's by Indian ambassador, but obviously Chinese at that time totally endorses, was saying that under the UNFCCC negotiations, famous saying that emission from developed countries, emission for luxury, and emission from developing countries, emission for survival. That was 1990s world. But if you look at today, so we have seen, if you just pick up one indicator, that China is the largest car market, so you probably just don't need to talk too far. So it's difficult for China to continue to say that, well, the emission from China is purely for survival. The world has changed. But so there's a sense of international responsibility. But on the other hand, I really need to put qualification here. This sense of responsibility is also constrained by the fact, on the one hand, China is the second largest economy. But on the other hand, if you look at per capita income, China is just ranked number 92. As so, Chinese like to say that the rest of the world, to say China as number 2, and inside China, we tend to stick ourselves at number 92. So you see the perception gap, because all in all, as Professor Xu said, that you look at the western part of China, and all in all, China is still a very poor country. So probably the rest of the world have never seen this situation. You have a very big, the second largest economy, but on the hand, a poor country. So how China assume international responsibility? It's a real challenge. It's very different from the rich world. You have the the size of the economy is advanced, and also the per capita income also very high. But how you deal with the situation? Not only China, same Brazil and also India. Brazil's 6th largest economy, India's 10th largest economy. If you look at India per capita income, even lower. So how you deal with this situation? We have those powerful, large economies, but in fact, by and large, are very poor countries. But all in all, I would say that in my personal observations, I think that those, all these different factors somehow make this whole dramatic change from this resistance to wholeheartedly embracing green growth and low carbon. And so now I would like to turn to that what China has done. And you may all have heard this whole China's 12th five-year plan. And I think one of the well-known economists once said that China's 12th five-year plan is the best climate document. Yes, indeed, that the Chinese policymakers like to say, yes, China, under the UNFCCC International, is only undertake this voluntary mitigation target. It was voluntary, but domestically, that target has been converted into part of 12th five-year plan, so it's domestically enforceable. And perhaps that is from my own work, that's most exciting, is that China now is moving towards a carbon market. And I like to spend a little bit of time on this. So it was even a surprise for us. We have worked, the World Bank has been working with China quite intensively on CDM. And if you look at the CDM market share, and China, by far, have largest market share. At peak time, 2008, 2009, the China's CDM market share takes up almost 70% the worldwide. So it's largest market player. And moving forward, and there's a whole uncertainty about the future of CDM. Clean development mechanism. Just to make sure everybody. But at the same time, that China, in fact, not too long ago, announced that, look, now their focus is more to explore domestic emissions trading scheme. In order to do that, they have set up pilots. So altogether, 7 pilots cover 5 cities and 2 provinces. And this cap and trade, we're talking about the real cap. So cap is not, for those pilots, we're not talking about intensity target. Because if you do cap and trade, intensity target is really very difficult. You really have to do absolute cap. So for all those 7 pilots, they are in the process of adopting the absolute cap. And then they will do the allocation to the entities and setting the baseline and this whole enforcement mechanism trading platform. So the question is why China decided to do that. A number of reasons. First is China has adopted this mitigation goal, and now the mitigation goal has been allocated to all the provinces. So how to achieve that? And then the joint experience of their energy intensity conservation target. At that time, is really a command control measures and has not been really effective. So moving forward, they want to say that whether a market instrument could reduce emissions more effectively and efficiently. So that's also this very important drive there. And also thirdly, there really is eyes beyond, I would say, beyond 2020. Yes, from between 2002 and 2020, China has undertaken internationally, this nationwide emission intensity target, but moving beyond 2020. And I think they're preparing themselves for much stringent target. And so what China can do, and so between now the next 8 years is a very important preparation stage. Preparation stage in the way that you collect data and understand all those mitigation assumptions and mitigation potentials, and also just to pilot this scheme, and with the eyes that beyond 2020, and there will be a nationwide emissions trading scheme, and moving forward. And we all talk about putting the price on carbon. And moving forward, that I think there's a long-term vision that if you look at the EU carbon market, I have no doubt it would survive the current turmoil. And you have Australia, and it will become effective. The carbon pricing mechanism will become effective in July. And Australia is talking to EU about potential linking. And then you have Chinese carbon market. You start with piloting, then moving toward a nationwide scheme. So in the long term, potential you will see actually a quite powerful, if not a global carbon market, because probably it's difficult to talk about global without the US, but it's a quite, I would say, sizable market, I would say, in post-2020 beyond. And China certainly say that it wants to play a leadership in this area, and it is. This initiative I'm leading, this partnership market readings, we have seen the Chinese impact. China is moving towards a market instrument, a domestic emissions trading scheme, and we see Brazil also has its own target, and they are also exploring the domestic market instrument, in particular the carbon market, and how the cap and trade would be suitable there. And also we see that since China is moving toward that direction, we see the regional impact, say on Indonesia, on Thailand, on Vietnam, and all of them, in fact, one way or another, are exploring this voluntary domestic trading market. So at least from our perspective, we say that potentially there's such a positive trend and among the emerging economies that are moving toward this direction. And I always say that we were in China and Australia. Somehow you really feel inspired and encouraged. You move toward, you went to that part of the world because just so much going on and real actions are taking place. You talk to government policymakers, you talk to companies, you talk to those trading platforms, that there's absolutely the energy that this want to make this happen. So that's about carbon market. I'm happy to talk about more if you're also in the corridor to share with you about the Chinese carbon market. But I do actually want to say a few words on the challenges in setting up in China, the carbon market. I remember just a few days ago, okay, 3 minutes, somebody say that the cap and trade is just absolutely suitable for China. So the cap is somehow resembling command and control economy, so you can put a cap. And trading, the Chinese just love trading. There's no wonder that China becomes one of the largest exporter, and also is. But on the other hand, the most important ingredient is data. And that is still a very long way to go. That's why the data that you need to, in order for trading to happen, and you need to have reliable and credible data. And I would say that certainly is a long way to go. And we are hoping that between now and 2020, this 8 years, that it will be, through this 8 years, through this piloting, and it would build up credible data and reliable transparency data. But I don't think that I feel that I should not stop without share some thoughts about relationship between US and China. And I always say that, and sometimes I heard this, I think it's quite correct, at least my own experience. They say that China and the US is like a bad marriage. And they scream at each other, but in the end, they have to find a way to live together for the sake of children. Is that? And I found that somehow it's true. And there's some, if you think about the Chinese negotiators, US negotiators and policymakers, there's kind of natural understanding about each other, that their problem, challenges, each country face. There's kind of natural understanding, but this does not, of course, convert into some cooperation. That's a different aspect. There's natural understanding, but on the other hand, I would say that there has been a lot of fear. outside the US and China, in particular other countries, they worry this G2, China and US, the two biggest emitters, which take up more than 30% of global share of emissions, that this so-called coalition of inaction, by blaming each other, so they form this kind of odd, bizarre coalition not to act. But I have to say that I have not seen this really happening. And the only thing I have seen that throughout the years that have always some contentious issues between the two countries. Previously was that USA or China not really part of this commitment of the Kyoto Protocol. That's why US should not be part of the. This is one of the reasons. That's one. At a certain point of time, that was one of the major issues. And then there was during the Copenhagen this famous MRV transparency. So it became a kind of big contentious issue between the two countries. And moving forward, the new word I have heard last time was so-called symmetry. I'm sure Dan knows quite well. The symmetry in that, in the sense that China, US should undertake some comparable obligations. So if US undertakes legally binding, and China should also undertake legally binding. So there's some symmetry there. One way or another should find a balance. So that's the next, I've been saying, probably the issue between these two countries. Regardless, what I have seen, what I'm thinking is that regardless of negotiations, every country has its own strategy, and for China, of course, it's also fighting for international space, right? But more important is that China is taking action on the ground, and it's moving quite fast and very serious. And just say that we have seen the 5-year plan carbon market is moving and very positively, and there's a possibility that when China moves, and if US still stays where it is, and you really see the gap between these two countries, and whether that would really lead to divorce, let's see. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's just what we're looking for. So thank you, Shuai-Wan. Mark Levine is next. He's the group leader of the China Energy Group at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. He graduated summa cum laude from Princeton, earned a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. Has been the recipient of a Fulbright Scholarship, Woodrow Wilson Fellowship, National Institute of Health Doctoral Awards. Worked on the analysis of energy efficiency issues during his leadership of the Energy Analysis Program at LBNL. He was director of the Environmental Division there, focusing on buildings efficiency, indoor air quality, and various clean energy technologies. But he says his major passion now is China and energy efficiency there. He's the group leader of the China Energy Group, which he founded. He's the board member for 5 leading nonprofits in the United States about energy efficiency. I'm not going to read them off. And one in Asia. He's founded or co-founded 2 successful nonprofits, including the acclaimed Beijing Energy Efficiency Center. He's member of the Energy Advisory Board of Dow Chemical Company and Advisory Board of Asian Pacific Energy Research Center in Tokyo. I hope this is all up to date. In addition to authoring on numerous technical publications, he's led a series of high-profile energy analysis activities and has had overall responsibility for the IPCC's chapters on mitigating carbon emissions in buildings in the 2nd assessment report and shared responsibility in the 4th assessment report. And so on. Co-leader of the report Scenarios for a Clean Energy Future for the United States, and co-leader for a major study of energy and carbon futures in China. So Mark, thank you for coming all the way from California. Really appreciate it. Look forward to your remarks. And you get the record award for the quick turnaround time on an invitation. I sent Mark an invitation. How do I get this to go on? Lynn, oh, video mute. Here, it's blinking away. Okay.
So this is the title that I was given, and I like it, Efficiency in China's Energy Appetite. I'm going to talk about past, present, and future. My perspective on this is that for the next 20 years or so, what happens in energy demand will be the largest determinant of emissions of greenhouse gases and CO2, that after that period we can think about significant new supply technologies, but during that period we'll develop the supply technologies, and what happens during that period is critical. And of course what happens in China is particularly critical. I just wanted to give one example of the importance of energy efficiency. You all know about Three Gorges Dam, 18 gigawatts of power, results in around 100 terawatt hours per year of output. Now, it took about 20 years for Three Gorges Dam to be constructed. In 20 years, appliance standards, refrigerators will be, standards on refrigerators will be at least 2/3 of Three Gorges, and then air conditioners, and we're at double Three Gorges, and if we put all the rest in, we're at 5.5 times Three Gorges. So while everyone has heard of this enormous construction project, Three Gorges Dam, hardly anybody knows much about appliance efficiency and appliance efficiency standards, and yet the impact is enormous. I want to turn to something else that very few people know about, energy and economic growth in China. When I first went to China in 1986 to the first conference on international conference on energy demand, I discovered that energy was growing much slower than the economy. And I had a hard time believing that, because everybody knows that everybody knew back then that for developing countries, in order for them to develop, they needed energy, and they needed energy to grow faster than GDP. Well, in fact, there is GDP for China, and there is energy growth for China. Remarkable decoupling between the two. And this was not a coincidence. This was a consequence of policy in China. Had that not occurred, we would have been overwhelmed by China's emissions, but in fact, that was the result. Now, I think you've seen this chart earlier. No, that's good. Delighted. This is a little different version of it, in that in the year 2000, all this turned around. The improved, the reduction in energy intensity, which had been decreasing, consistent with the chart I showed with GDP and energy growth, it turned around, and a pessimistic view is that that would continue to be the case. Kind of middle of the road view is that one might at least be able to stabilize that situation. And an optimistic view is that we could get back to the trajectory that China had been on during that period of time. I do want to show you the implication of that tiny bend in the curve. This is CO2 emissions through 2000, and then beyond you can see a simple extrapolation of CO2 from China. In fact, that's what happened. So that little change in the curve has a huge impact. And indeed, during this period of time, China overtook the US in CO2 emissions, and this was a surprise to everybody. IEA had these lines crossing after 2020. The Chinese themselves had these lines crossing around the same time period. And so this takeoff was really quite surprising. In spite of that, one has to recognize that China is just slightly above the global average in per capita CO2 emissions. Now, that's important, obviously, in the climate change negotiations because it is per capita emissions that matter. You wouldn't want to compare countries of vastly different sizes in terms of overall emissions. In that case, Luxembourg could never catch up with anybody else. On the other hand, it suggests a very large potential for China to increase its emissions, given that the emissions are low compared to, well, the US, for example. Let me show you what drove these emissions during this period of time. You look at steel production, and again, I extrapolate that from 2000 on to 2007, and there's what happened. And the same with cement production. And now I want to turn, so these are obviously worrisome sorts of things, but I want to move from the period 2002 to 2005 to the next period of time, which is the 11th five-year plan, 2005 to 2010. And here, China took on the enormous challenge of bending that curve. The Politburo announced in November of 2005 that China would have a reduction in energy intensity of 20% in 5 years. And remember, energy intensity had been increasing for the 3 years before that. So if we look at that curve again, there was our pessimistic forecast. There was our optimistic forecast. And in fact, China was remarkably able to turn that around in a very short period of time. And I have to say, I work with the people who are involved in, very involved at Energy Research Institute, NDRC, in energy demand and climate change. And there was great reluctance to, on the one hand, that was policy, and by God, if it's policy, China's going to achieve it. On the other hand, it was a really tremendous goal to rebuild the policy bureaucracy for energy demand and energy efficiency in a short period of time. And I could go into many of the things that were done to make that happen, but let me not for reasons of time. So, yeah, because my most important message concerns the future, which, while one doesn't know what it'll be, it's unknowable. One does know parameters that influence it. And I want to show you our base forecast. And what you notice is a bend in the curve and a plateauing of energy demand growth in the area of around 2030. And we have a low demand growth, again a plateau in that same period. The top, well, okay, here was the Chinese government numbers, our Energy Research Institute numbers. Note the straight line after 2020. That is, one assumes that there will be a break in the curve as GDP reaches a lower growth rate, and so you see the break around 2020, but the increase continues as a straight line. This is the IEA reference case, again, a straight line. This is a lower case for Energy Research Institute, again, a straight line. So the issue really is, you know, what's that bend all about? Well, this will just show you the same thing, but it shows you that energy demand grows only about 70% in China during this period of time. And for our low case, it grows at less than 50% during the same period of time. What I have to explain here is what is different between what we've done and what you see the other models and scenarios producing. And the huge difference is that our model is built from absolutely the bottom up, so that we have number of refrigerators, saturation of refrigerators, energy use of refrigerators in the model. The same with house size, saturation of air conditioners, efficiency of air conditioners, and on and on and on. And what we see in the time period between 2025 and 2030 is the saturation of all that equipment. And so at some point, and roughly at that time, you find a situation where there is no basis for continued demand growth in terms of adding more equipment to households and for other uses. Now, the same thing applies to cars. That is, you see a very rapid growth in the near term, but we've assumed for the longer term that the fraction that the auto ownership in China is half that of the United States today, which is substantially higher than Japan today, Korea today. That is to say, given the density of population of China, our assumption about number of vehicles is likely on the high side. Now, we test this. Let me give another example. Fertilizer demand has been growing in China for some time. If you do a simple extrapolation, it would grow indefinitely. In reality, the intensity of fertilizer use in China is above the desired level. The government would have it decline. Arable land is not growing in China. They're out of farmland. There'll be only modest growth, if any. Furthermore, fertilizer in China is largely made from coal, and as time goes on, it will be made from natural gas. That'll be one of the highest uses of natural gas, and that means fertilizer production will be far less energy intensive than it is today. So you have no growth in the land, you have no growth in fertilizer intensity, and you have decline in energy per unit fertilizer. No way can it continue up. And you see that in many other cases. Now, we don't know what various factors, we can't say where this is going to level off very easily. It's a function of many different parameters. For example, in this case, we assume that the exports of iron and steel and other high-intensity products will be the same in quantity as today. Now, in fact, that's unlikely. The cost of those resources will increase as China uses them up. The desirability of exports of those products as China becomes wealthier will become less. The labor costs will be higher and will be lower in other countries. If one looks at a large number of variables, the important thing about this chart is that in all cases you see a leveling off, a bend in the curve around 2030. And so what I would conclude from this is first, one often hears, and Dan, you may in Washington, that, well, why should the United States care when China will grow in its energy use and CO2 emissions indefinitely? Well, we should care a lot for a lot of reasons, but we certainly shouldn't use China as an excuse for not caring. And indeed, the flattening out of the demand growth curve is a reason for relative optimism about the potential for reducing growth of CO2. So I think, and the other comment I would make from this chart is that what China does in the near term, and I think the 12th five-year plan, which is a continuation roughly of the 11th, 17% energy intensity reduction over 5 years, again, very significant challenge, indicates that China will continue, as it has, pursuing energy efficiency quite aggressively. And it is the energy efficiency that will determine the level at which this curve bends. So you can be higher or lower depending on energy efficiency and also production of energy-intensive material. That concludes my talk.
There is cause for optimism. That's what we needed to hear. The question is, what is the meaning of these, the high and low ranges? I'm sure everybody has a lot of questions or issues you'd like to bring up. Unfortunately, I think we need to try to stay on track so that we make sure we have get to hear the senator speaking very soon. So could we take about a 10-minute break? And I'm going to really mean 10 minutes so we can get back here at 11:17. So grab something to eat. The bathrooms are straight down the hall that way, but we're going to start promptly at 11:17.